In March 1525, a blacksmith named Hans Müller stood before 30,000 armed peasants near Lake Constance and spoke the words that would kill 100,000 people. "Look around you. Count our numbers. For every knight in Germany, there are 100 of us. We have scythes that can cut through their horses' legs, flails that can crush their helmets, and the rage of centuries. Why do we kneel?" Within weeks, 300,000 German peasants were in open revolt, organized into professional armies with artillery, cavalry, and battle standards. They won victory after victory against professional forces, captured cities, and for a brief moment, feudalism itself trembled. Then came the slaughter. This is the story of the German Peasants' War, the greatest military uprising in European history before the French Revolution, and the bloodbath that followed when the nobility remembered they had cannons. The German peasants of 1525 weren't the broken serfs of earlier centuries. These were men who had fought as landsknechts in Italian wars, who had learned pike drill and artillery service, who had seen nobles die to Swiss halberds and knew that armor wasn't invincible. The Black Death had killed so many that survivors could demand wages, could move to different lords, could imagine being free. Martin Luther's Reformation had taught them to read the Bible themselves, where they found no mention of serfdom or nobles. When they read, "All men are equal before God," they took it literally. The printing press spread radical pamphlets faster than authorities could burn them. Thomas Müntzer preached that the end times were here, and God demanded the mighty be cast down. By early 1525, southern Germany was a loaded cannon, waiting for a spark. The peasant armies didn't just rebel blindly. They created the most sophisticated political program of the medieval period. The 12 Articles of the Swabian Peasants, printed in 25,000 copies, laid out demands that were revolutionary. The right to elect their own priests, the abolition of serfdom, because Christ redeemed all men with his blood, the return of common lands stolen by nobles, fair trials, and an end to death taxes that robbed widows. These weren't requests, but military ultimatums backed by assembled armies. Sebastian Lotzer, a journeyman furrier, and Christoph Schappeler, a preacher, had created something unprecedented, a manifesto for revolution based on scripture and natural law. Every peasant band that rose carried printed copies. For the first time in history, a revolution had a mass-produced program. What terrified the nobility wasn't just peasant anger, but their military competence. These weren't mobs with pitchforks, but organized armies following the Swiss model that had dominated European battlefields for 50 years. They formed disciplined pike squares, with halberdiers and men with two-handed swords in front, crossbowmen, and the few arquebusiers on the flanks. Veterans of the Italian wars taught them to march in step, hold formation under cavalry charge, and coordinate multiple units. They captured noble arsenals and suddenly had real weapons, not just converted farm tools, but proper pikes, military-grade crossbows, and most terrifyingly, artillery. The peasant army of the Neckar Valley had 3,000 firearms and 18 field guns. They knew how to use them. The war's brutality peaked at Weinsberg on Easter Sunday, April 16, 1525. The peasant army under Jeklein Rohrbach captured the city and its castle after Count Ludwig of Helfenstein refused to surrender. What followed shocked even hardened contemporaries. The peasants formed a gauntlet of pikes, two lines of men with spears creating a corridor of death. Count Ludwig, his knights, and their servants were forced to run the spears, while drums played and peasants sang mockingly. The Count offered 30,000 gulden ransom, but Rohrbach wanted blood, not gold. Ludwig's wife, an illegitimate daughter of Emperor Maximilian, was forced to watch her husband stumble through the pikes, his body pierced dozens of times before finally dying. 16 other nobles met the same fate. The massacre became the nobility's rallying cry for extermination. Before Weinsberg poisoned their cause, the peasant armies had been winning. At Leipheim in April, 5,000 peasants defeated a smaller professional force, capturing their cannons. At Herrenberg, peasants successfully stormed a fortified city using coordinated assault with artillery support. The Battle of Schladming saw Austrian peasants destroy a force of mounted knights using prepared positions and concentrated crossbow fire. Near Böblingen, the Württemberg band of 15,000 peasants forced Duke Ulrich's professional army to retreat without a fight. The nobles simply couldn't believe peasants could form proper battle lines. These weren't lucky victories, but tactical successes by forces that understood contemporary military science. For a brief moment, it seemed the entire social order might actually collapse. The German nobility's initial response was pure panic. Many simply fled their castles, abandoning their lands. Others quickly agreed to the 12 Articles, buying time. The Archbishop of Mainz wrote, "The peasants have such numbers that if even 1 in 10 can fight, they have more soldiers than all German princes combined." Letters between nobles reveal their terror, not just of death, but of social inversion. The Margrave of Baden wrote, "They make us serve them wine while they sit in our chairs. The world is turned upside down." Some nobles tried negotiation, others fortified themselves, but most simply couldn't comprehend that their social inferiors had become a military force. The psychological shock paralyzed them for crucial weeks. Georg III, Truchsess von Waldburg, commander of the Swabian League's army, was the nobility's salvation. Unlike other nobles, he respected peasant military capability and responded accordingly. He had 10,000 professional landsknechts, 1,200 heavy cavalry, and most importantly, 30 modern artillery pieces. But he was outnumbered 10-1, so he used strategy over strength. Waldburg avoided large battles, instead targeting isolated peasant bands, using his cavalry's mobility to strike and retreat. He made separate truces with different peasant armies, then broke them when convenient. His greatest weapon was time. He knew peasant armies couldn't stay in the field during planting season. Every week that passed, more peasants slipped away to tend their fields, or their families would starve. Martin Luther's response to the Peasant War became one of history's great betrayals. Initially sympathetic, calling for nobles to consider peasant grievances, he turned violently against them after Weinsberg. His pamphlet against the murderous, thieving hordes of peasants called for total extermination. Let everyone who can smite, slay, and stab, secretly or openly, remembering that nothing can be more poisonous, hurtful, or devilish than a rebel. It is just as when one must kill a mad dog. This gave religious sanction to massacre. Protestant princes who might have hesitated now had theological justification for slaughter. The man whose ideas had sparked the revolution now blessed its suppression. Peasants who had seen Luther as their Moses now called him Judas. On May 12, 1525, at Böblingen, the war's outcome was decided. The Württemberg peasant army of 15,000 faced Waldburg's 8,000 professionals. The peasants had good position, artillery, and numerical superiority. Initially, they held their ground, their pike squares repelling cavalry charges. But Waldburg's experienced gunners found their range, and professional landsknechts knew how to advance under fire. When the peasant left wing broke, their entire line collapsed. What followed was less retreat than hunt. Waldburg's cavalry ran down fleeing peasants for miles. Contemporary accounts describe fields carpeted with bodies, streams running red, and wounded peasants begging for death rather than capture. 3,000 died in the battle, another 3,000 in the pursuit. The Württemberg uprising was effectively over. The final catastrophe came at Bad Frankenhausen on May 15, 1525. Thomas Münzer had assembled 8,000 peasants, mostly poorly armed, on a hill outside the city. They built a Wagenburg, a circular fort of wagons chained together, and waited for divine intervention. Münzer promised God would catch the prince's cannonballs in his sleeves. Instead, Landgrave Philip of Hesse and Duke George of Saxony surrounded them with 7,000 professional troops and artillery. The nobles offered amnesty if they surrendered Münzer. When refused, the cannons opened fire. The Wagenburg, effective against cavalry, was useless against artillery. After hours of bombardment, Landsknechts stormed the destroyed fortification. It was pure slaughter. 6,000 peasants died, most during the rout. Münzer was captured hiding in a bed, pretending to be sick. He was tortured and beheaded. After Frankenhausen, the war became extermination. Noble armies swept through rebellious territories with orders to kill without mercy. Entire villages were burned with inhabitants inside. Mass executions became entertainment. Nobles held banquets while watching peasants being broken on wheels. The Margrave of Ansbach had prisoners' eyes gouged out before execution. In Alsace, Duke Antoine of Lorraine killed 20,000 in 3 weeks. The Bishop of Würzburg boasted of executing 272 rebels in one day. Wives and children of rebels were branded and exiled. Fields were burned, livestock slaughtered, wells poisoned. It wasn't just suppression, but an attempt to depopulate rebellious regions. The nobility had discovered their numerical disadvantage could be solved through systematic murder. The suppression showcased new methods of mass killing that prefigured modern genocide. Nobles developed efficient execution systems, assembly lines of death where prisoners were processed in batches. At Saverne, peasants were arranged in rows, and Landsknechts competed to see how many heads they could take with a single sword stroke. Mobile execution units traveled between villages with portable gallows. Lists of rebels were compiled and tracked, an early form of death bureaucracy. The use of artillery against civilians in their homes was perfected. Mass drowning became popular, cheaper than other methods. At Kitzingen, 58 peasants were blinded and forced to march off cliffs. The nobility was learning how to industrialize murder. Modern historians estimate 100,000 peasants died, but contemporary accounts suggest higher. The Zimmern Chronicle records 130,000 dead. Some regions lost a third of their population. In Upper Swabia alone, 10,000 died. The Alsace saw 20,000 killed. Thuringia lost 8,000. Franconia perhaps 15,000. These numbers don't include those who died from starvation after their fields were burned or disease in devastated regions. Against this, noble casualties were minimal, perhaps 3,000 total, mostly at Weinsberg and minor skirmishes. The kill ratio of roughly 30.1 demonstrated the futility of challenging professional armies without equal weapons and training. The peasants had discovered they outnumbered knights 100 to 1, but knights had cannons, cavalry, and the willingness to commit genocide. The Peasants' War proved several military realities that would shape warfare for centuries. First, numbers alone couldn't overcome professional training and artillery. Second, armies needed consistent supply lines. Peasant forces collapsed when they ran out of food or needed to return to farming. Third, cavalry mobility remained decisive against infantry without proper anti-cavalry obstacles. Fourth, unified command was essential. The peasant bands never coordinated effectively. Fifth, and most importantly, social revolution required military victory first, political programs second. The peasants had elaborate manifestos but inadequate gunpowder. Future revolutionaries would learn, secure the arsenals first, write constitutions later. Ironically, the failed revolt achieved many of its economic goals. The massive death toll created such labor shortage that surviving peasants could demand better conditions. Serfdom, already weakening, essentially ended in many regions. Dead peasants couldn't work fields. Wages increased dramatically. Some territories abolished the most hated obligations to avoid future revolts. The common lands issue was partially resolved in peasants' favor. The demographic catastrophe forced nobles to make concessions they had refused before the war. The peasants lost militarily but won economically through the brutal mathematics of supply and demand. Their blood became the price of progress. The war split the Reformation permanently. Radical Reformation went underground, spawning Anabaptists and other sects that rejected both Catholic and Lutheran authority. Mainstream Protestantism became conservative, allied with princes against social revolution. The dream of Christian equality died in German fields. Churches, both Catholic and Protestant, blessed the slaughter and preached obedience more forcefully than ever. Yet peasant martyrs became folk saints. Songs about Münzer and other leaders circulated secretly for generations. The theological question, did Christ die to free souls only, or bodies too, was answered with sword and cannon. Souls could be saved, bodies would remain in bondage. The Peasants' War created two incompatible memories. Noble chronicles depicted it as Satan's rebellion against divine order, with peasants as murderous beasts deserving extermination. Peasant oral tradition remembered heroes fighting for God's justice against tyranny. Woodcuts showed both versions, peasants as devils with pitchforks or as martyrs dying for freedom. Songs, poems and stories kept the rebellion alive in popular memory. Every generation of German rebels would invoke 1525. The Nazis claimed the peasants as proto-nationalists. East Germany made them communist pioneers. The war became a mirror reflecting each era's conflicts. The only consensus was the number, 100,000 dead in one summer. News of the German catastrophe spread across Europe, affecting every potential rebellion. English peasants noted German tactics and failures when planning their own revolts. French nobles increased fortress garrisons. Spanish authorities crushed Comunero rebels more harshly, fearing German-style uprising. Italian city-states restricted weapons access. The Ottoman Empire, ironically, used German events to show Christian disunity to their own Christian subjects. But the real impact was psychological. Peasants everywhere learned that discovering they outnumbered nobles wasn't enough. Revolution required more than numerical superiority. It needed military professionalism, unified command, and the ability to match noble firepower. These lessons would simmer for 250 years until the French Revolution. The Peasants' War accelerated military professionalization across Europe. Nobles realized their traditional feudal levies were unreliable. Peasants might join rebels instead. Professional mercenary armies became essential. The Landschlecht system expanded. Standing armies began forming. Artillery became the supreme arbiter. Whoever controlled the cannons controlled society. Fortification design changed to account for armed peasant revolt. Military manuals began including sections on suppressing internal rebellion. The war proved that future conflicts wouldn't just be between states, but within them. Class war had become a military reality, requiring military solutions. The battlefield was now everywhere. The war's aftermath saw the first systematic codification of rebellion law. The imperial diet passed legislation making any gathering of armed peasants automatic treason. New legal categories were created for revolt crimes. Collective punishment was legalized. Entire communities could be executed for harboring rebels. The right to bear arms became exclusively noble. Even owning military manuals became suspicious for commoners. But subtle changes also occurred. Some territories created legal channels for grievance to prevent violence. The concept of customary rights gained legal standing. The absolute arbitrariness that sparked revolt was slightly curtailed. Law became both more oppressive and more defined. Peasants lost freedom, but gained predictability. The Peasants' War drove innovation in both peasant and anti-peasant weapons. Peasants perfected the Kriegsflagel, war flail, Agricultural tools converted to crush armor. They developed the bundled pike technique to stop cavalry. Their Wagenburg tactics influenced military thinking for decades. Nobles responded with lighter, more mobile artillery designed for use against infantry. Anti-peasant weapons were developed. Cavalry sabers designed to kill unarmored targets, early forms of grapeshot for crowd control, and incendiary weapons for burning villages. The crossbow experienced a revival, as nobles wanted weapons peasants couldn't easily capture and use. Both sides learned that future wars would be won through technological advantage, not just numbers or courage. Despite catastrophic defeat, peasants achieved hidden victories that historians only recently recognized. Written records, controlled by nobles, emphasized total peasant defeat, but local archives reveal thousands of negotiated settlements where peasants gained concessions. Some communities bought their freedom using war threats. Others gained forest and water rights. Many areas saw permanent reduction in labor obligations. The war created precedents for peasant legal action. Some peasant military leaders were pardoned and became local officials. The 12 Articles influenced legal reforms for centuries. Women who had fought alongside men gained some economic rights in widowhood. These small victories accumulated into structural change. Feudalism was mortally wounded, even if not immediately dead. The peasant leaders, despite defeat and death, became immortal in popular memory. Florian Geyer, the noble who sided with peasants, became a Robin Hood figure. Götz von Berlichingen, the iron-handed knight who briefly joined rebels, inspired literature for centuries. Thomas Müntzer evolved from failed prophet to proto-communist hero. Jacqueline Rohrbach, despite his brutality, was remembered as an avenger of peasant suffering. Their military innovations, elected officers, councils of war, written articles of war, influenced later democratic military organization. Even their failures taught lessons: the need for unified command, consistent strategy, and political programs backed by military force. Every subsequent revolution studied their successes and mistakes. Often erased from chronicles, women played crucial military roles in the Peasants' War. Black Hofmännin led 400 women warriors in Franconia, fighting with halberds and crossbows. Women defended Wagenburg fortifications while men sailed forth. They managed artillery during sieges, loading, aiming and firing cannons. At Weinsberg, women participated in the pike gauntlet killings. Noble women were specifically targeted for humiliation and violence. After defeat, women faced unique punishments: rape, branding, forced marriage to loyalists. Some regions executed women rebels by drowning, considered more appropriate than hanging. The Margravine of Baden reported that women fighters were worse than men, like wild animals. Women's participation challenged both social and gender order, doubling noble fury. The peasants didn't develop their military tactics in isolation. They learned from the Swiss, who had been defeating noble armies for 2 centuries. Swiss mercenaries secretly trained peasant bands in pike square formation. The Wagenburg was adapted from Swiss tactics at Morgarten and Sempach. Swiss commanders sold military knowledge to peasants, seeing German liberation as extending their own confederation. The similarity between Swiss cantonal democracy and peasant demands was obvious. Some Swiss cantons provided weapons and sanctuary for fleeing rebels. This international dimension terrified nobles. If German peasants succeeded like the Swiss, the entire feudal order could collapse. The suppression's brutality partly reflected fear of Swiss-style republican contagion spreading across Europe. Both sides developed sophisticated intelligence networks during the war. Peasants had advantages: servants in every castle, workers in every city, priests sympathetic to reform. They knew noble movements before nobles themselves. The peasant bush telegraph spread news faster than noble messengers. But nobles had literate spies who could intercept and read peasant correspondence. They planted agents, provocateurs, to encourage premature uprising. Torture produced intelligence about peasant plans. The Swabian League created an early intelligence service, tracking rebel leaders across territories. Code systems developed on both sides. The war became as much about information as weapons. Peasants lost partly because noble intelligence improved faster than their own, allowing surgical strikes against leadership. The decisive factor in peasant defeat was artillery inequality. Peasants captured some cannons, but lacked consistent powder supplies and trained gunners. Noble armies had professional artillery trains with master gunners, consistent powder quality, and various shot types. At key battles, noble artillery devastated peasant formations before contact. Peasant-made powder was inconsistent. Cannons exploded, killing crews. They couldn't produce enough iron shot, using stone balls that shattered on impact. Transportation was impossible. Peasant cannons were abandoned when retreating. Nobles targeted peasant artillery first, knowing its propaganda value exceeded military worth. The sound of noble cannons became psychological weapon. Many peasant bands fled hearing artillery approaching. Technology trumped numbers decisively. The war's timing revealed peasant vulnerability. They couldn't fight during planting or harvest without starving their families. Nobles deliberately prolonged campaigns into agricultural seasons. Peasant armies hemorrhaged men who had to return to fields. Those who stayed fought knowing their families might starve. Nobles burned grain stores in rebellious areas, creating famine. They destroyed mills, making grain useless. Livestock were systematically slaughtered. Salt supplies, essential for food preservation, were controlled. Wells were poisoned with corpses. The strategy was explicit: make rebellion mean starvation. After the war, rebellious regions faced years of hunger. Some areas didn't recover agricultural productivity for a generation. Famine killed more than battle, achieving noble goals of depopulation. Hunger succeeded where swords had initially failed. The German Peasants' War of 1525 truly ended the Middle Ages, though not how peasants intended. The feudal system survived nominally, but was transformed beyond recognition. Professional armies replaced feudal levies. Centralized states emerged from the chaos, reducing noble autonomy. Religious unity shattered permanently. The printing press had proven revolutionary potential. Economic relationships shifted toward wage labor and capital. The idea that social order was divinely ordained died in German fields. It now required cannons to maintain. Peasants had demonstrated they could organize, fight, and nearly win. The nobility's genocidal response showed their essential weakness, needing mass murder to maintain position. The old world died in 1525. The early modern age was born from 100,000 corpses. The peasants lost their war, but changed history forever. They had discovered they outnumbered knights 100 to 1. Next time, they would remember to count the cannons first.